Before alarms, before schedules, before anyone asked what was for breakfast, something was already simmering, soaking, or resting on the counter. Nothing came from a box. Nothing was rushed. Breakfast wasn't about convenience. It was about setting things right before the day had a chance to get complicated. These are 20 breakfasts my grandma actually made from scratch. Not for nostalgia, not for tradition. 1. Oatmeal cooked slowly with salt. Oatmeal was never treated as plain or unimportant in my grandmother's kitchen. It was cooked slowly and deliberately, using only oats, water, and a careful pinch of salt. She believed sugar distracted from what oats were meant to be, masking their natural depth instead of respecting it. She stood at the stove while it cooked, stirring steadily, not because it demanded constant movement, but because attention mattered. The oats softened at their own pace, swelling and releasing their starch until the porridge thickened naturally, turning smooth and creamy without any help. There was no rushing and no shortcuts allowed. When it was ready, the oatmeal was served plain, quietly steaming in the bowl. The salt sharpened the flavor, giving it a satisfying fullness that lingered long after the last bite. This wasn't breakfast meant to impress or excite. It was breakfast meant to ground you, steady you, and carry you calmly into the rest of the day. 2. Fresh cornmeal porridge. Cornmeal porridge always began as dry grain, treated with care long before it ever met the stove. My grandmother soaked it first, convinced it cooked more evenly and tasted better that way. When it was ready, she simmered it slowly with water and salt, never rushing the process. The pot stayed at a gentle heat, just enough to let the grain soften and thicken on its own. She stirred patiently, breaking up lumps by hand, watching the texture more than the clock. Speed never mattered to her, consistency did. Sometimes she added a little milk near the end to soften it further. Other mornings she left it plain, depending on what the day ahead demanded. As it cooked, the kitchen filled with a warm, earthy smell that felt grounding and familiar. The porridge was thick, filling, and deeply satisfying. This wasn't breakfast meant for convenience. It was food designed to sustain real work, the kind that stayed with you long after you left the table. 3. Homemade flatbread on the pan. Before breakfast ever reached the table, dough was already resting on the counter. It was made from flour, water, salt, and thyme. Nothing added, nothing rushed. My grandmother portioned it by feel, pressing each piece flat with her hands before laying it onto a hot pan. There were no measurements written down, only experience guiding the process. She listened as it cooked, watching for small bubbles to rise and feeling for the right moment to turn it. The bread puffed gently, blistering in places, and came off the pan soft, warm, and alive. The smell alone signaled that the day had begun properly. It was eaten immediately, spread with butter, paired with eggs, or torn apart on its own. It never lasted long. This was bread made for that exact morning, meant to be shared and finished, not saved or stored away. 4. Fried eggs in rendered fat. Eggs were never fried in oil in my grandmother's kitchen. They were cooked in rendered fat, saved carefully from previous meals, because she believed real flavor was something you built over time. Nothing was wasted, and nothing was rushed. The pan heated slowly, giving the fat time to melt and coat the surface evenly. Eggs were cracked cleanly, one at a time, with practiced hands. The whites set gently, turning opaque without stiffening, while the edges crisped just enough to add texture. The yolks stayed soft and rich unless someone specifically asked otherwise. Seasoning came only at the very end. A simple pinch of salt was all she added. She said eggs didn't need help when they were treated properly. Cooked with patience and respect, they spoke for themselves. 5. Boiled potatoes with butter and salt. Sometimes breakfast was as simple as potatoes. They were boiled whole, skins left on, never peeled beforehand. My grandmother said peeling too early stole both flavor and nourishment, so the potatoes were left intact until the very end. She cooked them slowly, checking for doneness by feel rather than time. At the table, each potato was split open by hand, steam rising as butter was pressed into the center and allowed to melt naturally. A careful sprinkle of salt followed, nothing more. The simplicity was the point. There was no need to dress it up or turn it into something else. This was breakfast meant for long mornings in cold weather, the kind of food that settled in your stomach and stayed there. It was steady, grounding nourishment, the kind that quietly carried you through hours of work without asking for attention. 6. Pancakes made from scratch batter. Pancakes were never made from a mix in my grandmother's kitchen. She measured flour, eggs, milk, and leavening by eye, trusting experience more than written instructions. Once the batter came together, she let it rest briefly, giving it time to settle and thicken before it ever touched the pan. The pan was greased lightly, just enough to prevent sticking. Each pancake was poured carefully and left alone until bubbles formed and slowly popped on the surface. Only then did she flip it, once and never again. There were no towering stacks and no heavy pours of syrup, meant to hide mistakes. Sometimes the pancakes were eaten simply with butter melting across the top. Other mornings they came with fresh fruit. They were always served warm, always filling, and always treated as real food, not a shortcut or a treat. 7. Leftover rice reheated properly. Rice was never wasted in my grandmother's kitchen. Leftover rice was treated with the same care as freshly cooked food. She sprinkled a little water over it, covered the pot, and reheated it slowly so the steam could bring it back to life instead of drying it out. Sometimes it was eaten plain, warm and simple, just as it was. Other mornings, it was topped with an egg, vegetables, or whatever needed using up. Nothing was added without purpose. The goal wasn't variety, it was respect. This kind of breakfast honored the work done the day before. Food didn't reset every morning or start over from scratch just because the sun came up. Meals carried forward, connected to one another, and were treated as part of a continuous rhythm rather than something disposable. 8. Savory egg scramble with vegetables. Vegetables were always chopped fresh each morning in my grandmother's kitchen. Whatever needed using up, onions, greens, or whatever was on hand, went into the pan first. She cooked them gently, letting onions soften and greens wilt just enough to retain flavor and color. Eggs were added last, folded in carefully and stirred slowly, never hurried. The goal was a soft, cohesive mixture, perfectly cooked but never dry or overdone. Every bite was nourishing, balanced, and comforting, the kind of food that felt intentional without requiring fuss. This was breakfast that made sense in its simplicity. It wasn't flashy or complicated, but it was thoughtful, steadying, and satisfying. Each morning it reminded you that care and attention mattered more than complexity, and that even a humble meal could hold weight and warmth. 9. Toasted bread with real butter. Bread was toasted slowly over gentle heat, never rushed or blasted. My grandmother used real butter, soft and creamy, letting it melt naturally into every warm nook and crease of the bread. There was no jam, no sugar, no fuss, just bread treated with care and respect. She believed that when bread was good, it didn't need any explanation or embellishment. The warmth, the slight crunch of the toast, and the richness of the butter were enough. Each bite was simple, satisfying, and grounding, a quiet reminder that proper food didn't need adornment to be enjoyed. Breakfast started with patience, attention, and respect for even the humblest of ingredients. 10. Simple breakfast. Soup. Some mornings began with soup, a gentle start to the day, a clear, light broth simmered slowly, filled with tender vegetables, sometimes grains, or an egg stirred in at the last moment. Each ingredient softened at its own pace, releasing flavor without ever needing to shout. The soup warmed you from the inside out, quiet and comforting in a way that more elaborate breakfasts couldn't match. It wasn't flashy or complicated, but it filled both stomach and spirit, reminding you that nourishment didn't need to be loud. In my grandmother's kitchen, breakfast wasn't about showmanship. It was about care, patience, and the steady rhythm of food that started the day right. Even a simple bowl of broth could hold you, steady you, and carry you gently into the morning. 11. Hand-grated root vegetables. Potatoes and root vegetables were always prepared by hand, grated finely and squeezed gently to release just enough moisture. My grandmother shaped them into thin cakes and cooked them slowly on a hot pan, turning them only when the edges were crisp and golden. The inside stayed soft and tender, a perfect contrast to the crunch outside. She salted them carefully, never too much, letting the natural flavors speak for themselves. The process took time, but it was worth every minute. As the cakes sizzled, the kitchen filled with a comforting, earthy aroma that signaled the day had begun properly. These were more than just breakfast, they were a ritual, a way to start the morning with patience, care, and the simple satisfaction of good food made from scratch. 12. Fresh fruit, prepared by hand. Fruit was always treated with care in my grandmother's kitchen. Each piece was peeled and sliced by hand, arranged thoughtfully, and shared around the table. It was never dumped from a bag or eaten distractedly while doing something else. Sometimes she added a light sprinkle of salt to enhance the natural sweetness. Other times it was served plain, fresh, and unadorned. The ritual of preparing and eating fruit was part of the breakfast, not an afterthought. She believed fruit deserved attention just like any other dish. Each bite was meant to be noticed, appreciated, and savored. Even something as simple as fruit became a lesson in mindfulness, patience, and respect for ingredients, a quiet reminder that every part of the meal mattered. 13. Thick porridge made the night before. Some porridge began its life the night before when grains were soaked carefully to soften and prepare for the next day. In the morning, my grandmother cooked it gently over low heat, never rushing the process, letting the grains swell and release their natural starches at their own pace. Texture was everything. The porridge needed to be smooth, thick enough to satisfy, yet light enough to eat without effort. It was sustaining, filling both stomach and spirit, giving energy that lasted long into the day. This wasn't about convenience or shortcuts. It was planning, patience, and respect for the ingredients, a quiet lesson that good food often requires time and foresight. Every spoonful was proof that care and intention mattered as much as taste. 14. Homemade yogurt or cultured milk. Milk in my grandmother's kitchen wasn't always just plain milk. Sometimes it was cultured naturally, left to thicken gently, developing flavor and richness all on its own. She never added sugar, flavoring, or shortcuts. She trusted time to do the work. Served slowly, spoon by spoon, it became something more than a drink. It was creamy, subtle, and nourishing. A quiet start to the day that required nothing flashy. This was breakfast that valued process over packaging, patience over convenience. It reminded you that good food didn't need embellishment, just care, attention, and the slow transformation that only time could provide. Every mouthful carried that quiet wisdom, grounding the morning in simplicity and intention. 15. Fried leftover bread. Stale bread was never discarded in my grandmother's kitchen. Instead, she sliced it carefully and fried it gently in rendered fat until each piece turned golden and inviting. The edges became crisp, while the centers stayed soft and tender, creating a perfect balance of texture in every bite. It was always eaten warm, straight from the pan, often as part of breakfast or a simple snack. There was no rush, no need for adornment. The flavor spoke for itself. Waste wasn't an option. Every loaf, every slice, every crumb had a purpose. Turning yesterday's bread into something nourishing was as much a part of the meal as the eggs, porridge, or fresh fruit. It was a quiet lesson in resourcefulness, patience, and respect for the work that went into food. 16. Simple grain cakes. Grains were cooked slowly, then shaped carefully by hand into small, compact cakes before being pan-fried to a gentle golden brown. Each cake held together not because of additives, but because the ingredients were treated with care and respect throughout the process. They sizzled quietly in the pan, releasing a warm, earthy aroma that filled the kitchen without demanding attention. The texture was soft inside with a lightly crisp exterior, simple yet deeply satisfying. This was breakfast that didn't seek excitement or showmanship. It asked only for patience, from the cook and from those eating it. Every bite rewarded that patience, proving that humble, attentive preparation could turn even the simplest grains into food that grounded you for the day ahead. 17. Eggs poached without vinegar. Eggs were poached gently in calm, simmering water. No tricks, no additives, nothing to force them along. My grandmother always said that good eggs would behave on their own if you treated them properly. She lowered them in carefully, letting the water do its quiet work. The whites set just right, holding the yolks in a delicate cradle, while the yolks remained soft, rich, and runny. There was no hurry, no flipping, no fuss, just patience and attention. The result was simple, elegant, and satisfying. Each poached egg carried the quiet assurance that careful handling mattered more than any shortcut. Breakfast was steady, nourishing, and honest, and poached eggs like these embodied that philosophy perfectly. 18. Vegetables cooked before anyone woke up. Some mornings, the kitchen smelled of onions long before the sun rose. Vegetables were already sizzling quietly in the pan, filling the air with warmth and promise. Breakfast didn't begin when people woke up. It had been slowly coming together while the house was still asleep. The careful chopping, gentle stirring, and soft cooking had already done their work, so the first bite was ready the moment anyone sat at the table. It wasn't about rushing or alarm clocks. It was about rhythm, preparation, and the quiet care that went into feeding a family. By the time plates were set, the meal was more than food. It was a signal that the day could begin with patience, warmth, and nourishment. 19. Bread dipped into warm milk or broth. Bread was softened gently in warm liquid, left to absorb just enough to become tender without falling apart. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't sweet. There were no sauces or adornments, just the simple, honest texture of bread made comforting. Every bite was meant to be eaten slowly, savored for its warmth and subtle flavor. It was breakfast that grounded you, filling both stomach and spirit, a reminder that food didn't need extravagance to be satisfying. This was comfort food in its purest form, humble, steady, and intentionally simple. The act of eating it became part of the morning ritual, a quiet moment of nourishment before the day fully began. 20. Tea or coffee made with care. Even drinks were made from scratch in my grandmother's kitchen. Water was brought to a proper boil, never hurried, and leaves were steeped patiently, releasing their flavor slowly and fully. There were no shortcuts, no prepackaged mixes. Every cup demanded attention and care. Nothing was rushed, and nothing was wasted. The process itself became part of the breakfast ritual, a quiet moment before the day began in earnest. Each sip was measured, savored, and appreciated, grounding the morning with warmth and flavor. Breakfast ended only when the cup was empty, a signal that nourishment had been taken fully and thoughtfully. Even something as simple as tea or coffee carried the same quiet respect and intention that defined every other dish on the table. My grandmother didn't cook breakfast to impress anyone. She cooked it because the day deserved a proper beginning. Everything took time. Everything required attention. And somehow, because of that, Everything felt easier afterward. These breakfasts weren't trends, they were habits, and habits done long enough become a way of living.